In this video, you're gonna learn about what happens to Simon Legree, Cassy, and Uncle Tom, and other characters in the last few chapters of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Hi, my name is Jeremy, and welcome to Elwyn Studios. This section is the climax of the novel. Uncle Tom and a handful of other slaves are sold to a cotton farmer who lives about 10 miles away from any other farm or town in the area. Some important characters that you need to know about are Simon Legree. He is the master of the plantation and the worst slaveholder you can dream up. He's taken to beating his slaves into submission and is also highly superstitious. Sambo and Quimbo. They are Legree's overseers. Slaves who had been turned by Legree to do exactly what he says and to treat the other slaves exactly as he would. Both fight with each other constantly for Legree's approval. Emmeline. She's a beautiful girl of about 15 years of age. At the auction, Tom had witnessed her being separated from her mother. Legree had outbid everyone else, including a man who was trying to buy her and her mother to keep them together. Cassy. She has been Legree's slave and mistress for 5 years now. Her seemingly endless torture has made her dangerous. Sambo and Quimbo don't dare cross her, and even Legree is a bit afraid of her. Legree's slaves. Uncle Tom had never seen a sadder bunch. Worked all day with little food, little sleep, and barely enough clothes on their backs. Legree was the type of slaveholder who thought it cheaper to replace slaves that died than to keep current slaves healthy. One day, while picking cotton, Tom notices that Cassy is among the field hands. She and Legree had been fighting, and she is out here proving that his threats of putting her to work mean nothing to her. And everyone almost believes it. She's picking cotton faster than all the other slaves, and even Tom. Another slave near Tom is quite the opposite. She had been brought with him and Emmeline at the auction, and it seems what little strength she had already is fading, and she is about to faint. Tom quietly comes over and puts some of his cotton into her basket. She begs him not to, but he says he can take the punishment better than she. Even after Sambo comes over and hits Tom, he just looks up and puts the rest of his cotton into her basket. Cassy then comes over and puts some of her cotton into Tom's basket and tells him that the suffering that he will face here will leave him with no strength to protect even himself, let alone anyone else. Legree had planned to make Tom an overseer when he brought him. Sambo's report of everything that Tom and Cassy did gave him an idea. At the end of the day, all the slaves bring in their work, and Legree weighs the sickly woman's basket. Though it's clear that all the quota is matched, Legree says that she didn't pick enough. He then commands Tom to beat the woman. But Uncle Tom outright refuses. Legree is shocked. Since Tom is a soft-spoken and quiet man, Legree thought he would be easily broken. He strikes Tom across the face and tells him that he is his master, both body and soul, since he bought him. But blood runs down Uncle Tom's face, but as this happens, he looks up and laughs with joy. He declares to Legree and all the other slaves present that his soul has already been bought by God, and no amount of money or whipping can take that from him. This is Uncle Tom's most heroic moment in the novel. Even facing the worst, he is able to stand tall and have joy, something that none of the other characters in the book could ever do. Legree orders Sambo and Quimbo to give Tom a beating he won't forget. And so that night, Tom is on the floor with cuts and bruises. He can barely move. Cassy, after witnessing all that happened, steals away from the house and nurses his wounds, as she has done so often with countless other slaves. She cleans all his cuts and gives him as much water as he can drink. When she is finished, Cassy looks at the suffering man and begins to cry. She tells Tom of all the others who had hoped before him. None lasted long. Here, Cassy tells Tom her entire life story. She had grown up in a very well-to-do family. Her father had promised to free her and her mother someday, but his death came before then. Then Cassy was sold. Henry was her new master and lover. He treated her like his wife, but he wouldn't marry or free her, saying it was impossible. Then they had 2 children, Henry Jr. and Eliza. But then Henry's cousin came and got him into debt and in love with another woman. He then bought Cassy and the children to settle Henry's account. Henry's cousin was a terrible master. He told Cassy that if she was good, he wouldn't sell her children. But he did anyway. One day, after seeing her son in town, she went to her master's butler to beg for help, but he only laughed at her. Cassy snapped in that moment, and she attacked the butler, but then she blacked out. The next thing she remembered was being in a bed and taken care of. It was in a strange house. She was going to be sold again, this time to a man named Stewart. Stewart truly cared for Cassy. He even tried to find her children and buy them back. But Cassy's old master had some social influence and wouldn't allow it. Cassy and Stewart also had a son. But completely giving up hope, Cassy poisoned the baby, fully believing that the only good thing she could offer him was death. Stewart then also died suddenly, and Cassy was bought by Legree and had suffered under his rule ever since. Cassy tells Tom that God should not hold sin against them if they have no choice but to sin. But Uncle Tom says there's always a choice. If he were to give in now, he then might become like Sambo and make others suffer. This is Tom's only fear. A sudden realization comes over Cassy and she falls on the floor sobbing, now understanding that Tom is right. She stays with Tom a while and they read his Bible. Then she slips back into the house, no one knowing she was there. Many months go by and Legree has stopped beating Tom, since Tom is still his hardest worker. But he continues to hold a hate toward him. Many of the other slaves now look up to Tom, since he shows kindness that they're not used to. But in the house, Cassy is worried about Emmeline. She's afraid that the young girl will suffer just as she did. So one night, she drugs Legree and goes to wake up Tom. She tells him that Legree is sound asleep and that Tom can kill him and put an end to the suffering of all the slaves on the plantation. But Tom refuses. He tells Cassy that their suffering would be less if the blood of their master was not on their hands. Instead, Uncle Tom convinces Cassy to run away and take Emmeline with her. Cassy agrees, but Uncle Tom decides to stay. He believes it's his duty to continue to give hope to the other slaves. This is Cassy's plan. It's generally known throughout the plantation that Simon Legree is a very superstitious man. This is especially true when it comes to the attic, since Legree had at one time locked a slave girl in there until she starved to death. Cassy used this to her advantage. Over time, she played up stories saying she hears noises, and she opens the attic door at odd times, dresses as a ghost, and puts a bottle in a crack in the wall so the wind would sound like crying at night. Legree refuses to even go up the stairs to the attic now, so Cassy and Emmeline begin stashing food, money, and clothing there. Then one day, they each take a sack and run into the swamps. Sambo sees them and raises the alarm. So for several days, Legree, with his hounds and several of the slaves, search the swamps, but find nothing. Cassy and Emmeline had snuck back into the house and took all they needed into the attic, where they are staying until the hunt dies down. Believing that Uncle Tom knows something of the escape, Legree tries to beat Tom into telling him where they are. But Tom doesn't give in. Once Legree gives up and leaves, Sambo and Quimbo make Tom in bed and nurse him. They now realized all that they had done and ask Tom to tell them about his faith. Cassy also comes in the night to thank Tom for the sacrifice that he made to keep her and Emmeline safe. Several days pass, and it's clear that Uncle Tom is dying. But before he passes, none other but George Shelby ride up to free Tom and take him back to his family. Who is George, you ask? George Shelby is the son of Tom's first master. He was a teenager when Tom was sold, but he promised to find Tom and free him if he could. Tom had held on to the hope that George would come for him, but on Legree's plantation, his focus turned to helping Cassy and the other slaves. As Uncle Tom lay on his deathbed, he sees a young man enter and hears the familiar voice of his young master George. Though he's fading, Tom has a smile on his face. George tells him about all his plans to free Tom, but Uncle Tom says he's now going to have a better kind of freedom. Uncle Tom is glad that George has come at last, and now he knows that everyone he had helped along the way, his young master, Cassy, and even Sambo and Quimbo, all have hope because he never gave up. Cassy watches from the attic as George takes Tom and buries him. Realizing that George is a good man, she and Emmeline take their escape and meet George at the nearest town. Cassy tells him of their situation, and George promises to bring them to safety. That sounds like a good enough happy ending, but wait. As always, there's more. They are on a riverboat heading up the Mississippi when a woman starts talking to George about Kentucky, where he is from. She explains that she was once a slave, but a rich young man bought her, freed her, and married her, and took her to the West Indies. But he had recently died, and she was now on a search for her enslaved brother in Kentucky. George tells the woman that her brother, George Harris, had married one of his slaves, Eliza Harris. After Cassy listens to the two talk for a while, she realizes that the Eliza they are talking about is her own daughter. In the end, the whole family is reunited in Canada. Cassy finds her daughter married, happy, and with 2 children. And if that isn't a satisfying ending enough, Cassy's son had escaped many years earlier and was also reunited with his sister and mother. Oh yeah, they also were super rich now because Emily, the woman they met on the riverboat, had a fortune left her from her husband. They went to travel to France, and Emmeline fell in love and married the first mate of the ship they were on. Cassy becomes a Christian and is also able to raise her grandchildren after all that time without raising her own. George, he went back home and freed all of his slaves, including Uncle Tom's wife and their 3 children. He hired them on as employees instead, and told them each to remember it is because of Uncle Tom that they are free. If you learned something new from this video, you can click over here to have more brain-stimulating stuff, and over here to subscribe to stay up to date on all we got going on.